Thank you so much for joining this call.
Yeah.
So let's begin with the introduction. So who is Sigi Mwanzia?
Hi, my name is Sigi Mwanzia. I am a digital policy consultant at Article 19 Eastern Africa, which is a freedom of expression and access to information organization which operates in 14 Eastern African countries, including Kenya, Uganda, Rwanda, Tanzania. I won't expound the list here, but more information can be found on the website.
And maybe you can now dive into some of the questions and just having discussions around digital rights in Africa at the moment. What are digital rights and why are they important?
Okay, so thank you for that fantastic question. Digital rights are essentially human rights. They are essentially an extension of human rights onto the internet, digital communication platforms and services, amongst others. So when you think digital rights, just think human rights, but on digital platforms and digital communication platforms. Why are they important? Because digital has become the new mode of communication. It has become and offers very many fantastic opportunities for people not just to connect with each other in this increasingly globalized world, but it has also become a very useful platform for individuals to trade, for individuals to access information, amongst others. And as we've seen in countries which are holding elections currently, political campaigning is increasingly being conducted on social media platforms. It's increasingly being conducted on using the internet. And so these are just some of the examples as to why digital rights are so pertinent, not just today, but since the advent of the internet and digital communication services.
So there has been an increase in the digital rights violations, such as online users being targeted, internet shutdowns, especially during the election periods, as a means of control issues. So what do you think can be done to safeguard digital rights?
So just to answer the question, I think a lot is already being done to safeguard digital rights by not just by civil society organizations, but also by international organizations and also by certain governments, especially those which are not violating digital rights. There has been increasing efforts to heighten collaboration, not just between public and private state actors, but also between these PPs as well as civil society organizations, with the ultimate goal of targeting the people who matter the most, and that is citizens themselves, individuals themselves who access these platforms. So I'll just give a few examples of what we have done as Article 19 to combat some of these violations that you have mentioned. On the internet shutdowns front, Access Now is extremely vocal online as well as offline about the rights respecting measures that governments must put in force to either prevent these violations from occurring, and also essentially to promote universal access drives that civil society organizations have really been pushing and hammering for. One of the other methods that is often used to combat these violations includes strategic litigation. Organizations like ourselves, Unwanted Witness in Tanzania, Nubian Rights Forum in Kenya, have increasingly been turning to courts to rectify violations that have increased, that governments are increasingly committing in regards to digital rights, and essentially just calling on the courts to protect human rights on online platforms, and essentially to continue hammering this maxim that digital rights are human rights, that we increasingly that we have been hammering time and time again. I think I will stick to those particular points, unless there's something that you want me to expound on. Increasingly we have noticed as part of our monitoring activities that I think you mentioned this issue of legislative provisions being used to stifle individuals' ability to access the internet and to access digital platforms. We have realized that it's not enough to just make noise on social media platforms. It's not enough to send messages and letters and advocacy emails to governments, to international organizations which are tasked with keeping governments in check. But there's also a need to go to the ground And citizen education, public awareness is extremely pertinent. It's extremely important. Just constantly reiterating why human rights are important, why expression rights are important, why being able to access information about your personal data, etc., is extremely important with individuals on the ground. And I think that that's one of the forefronts that can be done to continue preventing violations. But there's also still, the ultimate responsibility rests with the state. But the state should also remember that it is their citizens who put them in that particular position, and so they should be working towards safeguarding and protecting and promoting the rights of their populace. I think one of the other calls that has increasingly come out, especially in regards to Uganda's election, is this issue of what responsibility do telecommunications companies have towards the individuals who they are providing services to, which then raises issues about lawful interception of communications by governments, the increasingly important role that these companies play in terms of providing access, not just providing it but also maintaining it, their complicity. So that they're how complicit they are in when they receive orders from governments to to restrict services, amongst others. And so these are just some of the challenges and the solutions and some of the actors that we should be casting a spotlight on, to continue pushing back against these violations.
Uganda has experienced at least 4 major internet shutdowns, and all of them have been election related. So, in the event of internet shutdown and maybe social media blackout, how can we stay informed?
So what we have been seeing, first and foremost, I think the core point should be reiterated that internet shutdowns are not and should not be used, except in very extreme cases as recognized under international human rights law, right? And they should be necessary, they should be proportionate, and they should be legitimate. So that's I think the first point that I want to reiterate. The second point, in terms of what citizens can do when the internet has been shut down, and what we've been seeing Ugandans using is to relying on VPNs. That's virtual private networks, amongst other measures. I think that is the one tool that we have seen Ugandans using, especially since the over-the-top taxation was imposed in the country. And so I think that should be one of the measures that they themselves should continue relying on and utilizing to be able to access the internet. And also to just as part of just going back to the point of political campaigns are increasingly using these platforms. So if citizens can continue accessing and utilizing on VPNs, then I think that might be a way of ensuring that they're able to bypass some of these restrictions that are being imposed not just by the state but also by private actors in the country.
And so we know that technology has assisted in documenting human rights abuses, election kind of malpractices, and also, aided the access to essential services such as healthcare. So, and we also know that internet shutdowns disrupt all this access to information and also access to such kind of services. So how can we prepare, especially in Africa, because it has actually been happening in a lot of African countries, how can we best prepare for internet disruptions?
Those are really interesting questions. That's a really interesting question. I think technology is a two-pronged device or tool. As you mentioned, it facilitates these rights, but it also has the potential to grant governments not extreme powers. But yeah, I mean, all those two-pronged challenges are often magnified quite very importantly. How can we prepare for internet disruptions? I think the first thing to that individuals can essentially rely on is, one, map out whether your country actually, whether your government actually utilizes internet disruptions as to disrupt and interfere with the electoral process and electoral integrity. I think that would be the first most pertinent advice to give to anyone in a country where, including Uganda, Ethiopia, amongst others. The second thing would be to form, these offline, online campaigns or groups to be able to facilitate information flows where So where transmitting information online has been restricted, then you should have other avenues of being able to continue disseminating information on offline platforms. I don't want to say use pamphlets or use posters, etc. But I mean, it's always very important to continuously maintain this balance between online and offline communication, especially due to increasing restrictions on the internet. How else can we prepare for internet disruptions? I think that, just going back to the issue of strategic litigation, it is very important when a government has shut down the internet for us to continuously push back against those restrictions before the courts. And if national courts are not able to understand the messages that we are trying to communicate when we tell them internet disruptions, where they do not follow the three-part test, are unlawful, then I think it's very important for us to continue pushing these messages to regional courts, including the East African Court of Justice, to the African Court on Human and People's Rights, amongst others. And even going as far as, forming, I think what has increasingly been done by CSOs is to form these regional groups, not just to use strategic litigation as one of the measures, but also to continuously raise and sensitize the public about internet disruptions. And then it's also very important to understand that internet disruptions are very different. So you can have, full-blown internet disruptions across the entire country. So you basically just have a blackout on everything, on all telecommunication services, on social media platforms and devices. You can also have throttling. You can have temporary disruptions of certain services during specific times of the day. It's also very important to understand what kind of measures, what kind of internet disruptions governments usually impose, and how to figuring out how to tackle these disruptions when they are applied by government. Yeah.
So I was asking, there has been attempts by African governments to clamp down on the freedom of expression, especially online, by tightening the registration process, adding taxes, and implementing rules and regulations that undermine the freedom of expression on online space. So what do you think will be the solution to navigate around this?
So the issue of taxation and registration requirements, not just for, which has continued to impact social media users, bloggers, journalists across the regions, are increasingly, and I think that this is something that Ephraim, liked to magnify when he was the program officer for Eastern Africa, and he kept mentioning these governments are increasingly finding new ways of restricting access for the populace. Taxation is one of them. Online registration requirements is another one that we've seen Uganda and Tanzania really implementing and really putting into practice, especially just before the electoral period, to also restrict the amount of people who are being able to access and use communication platforms, and also disseminating information. In Uganda and Tanzania, we've seen the imposition of over-the-top taxation. Kenya recently introduced its digital services taxation. And I think the taxation conversation is a bit, it needs, you need to take a very, holistic approach to this issue of digital taxation, because on one hand, you have governments across the world stating that they need to capture this new, quote unquote, a group of individuals or companies, sorry, not individuals, companies, who are offering services and not paying, their dues to the taxman, or to the taxman, essentially. But on the other hand, our argument has always been that if these taxation measures are, one, not conducted using prior cost-benefit assessment analysis, which must also include a human rights impact assessment, then essentially what will happen is you will have businesses who are being taxed, pushing these costs onto the consumer, which means that individuals will then, as we've seen in Uganda, I mean, so many students had to sacrifice accessing the internet, given the taxation implications, and the expense costs that they were starting to face during that particular time. In terms of the registration requirements that governments continue to impose, again, Uganda and Tanzania continue to surprise digital rights advocates across the world by imposing very onerous registration requirements on online users, including bloggers, including journalists, and placing very hefty fees, which consequently prevents, as you've mentioned, the individuals being able to disseminate the information and to access content online. And again, this goes back to the issue of what impact does it have on political campaigning. In terms of the solutions to navigate this, from the taxation perspective, we just drawing on some of the tools that individuals have used. I think VPNs continue to offer one of the solutions. In terms of registration requirements, which countries like Uganda and Tanzania have implemented, I believe the unwanted witness in Uganda is currently contesting those regulatory provisions. And we are planning on joining that particular petition as amicus curiae. And so again, going back to the issue of strategic litigation being one of the avenues. However, what we would have liked to have seen, and this is one of the messages that we keep pushing out as governments are preparing legislative and regulatory frameworks, is consult members of the public, right? Conduct prior assessments so that you can ascertain, you get a very holistic perspective of the implication of these new taxation measures or registration measures on people's rights, including access rights, because it's very contradictory for a government to state that they want to promote universal access to to the internet and to digital communication services, yet on the other hand, we're imposing these very punitive measures that restrict individuals from being able to gain access. So it's also important for governments themselves to identify what kind of narrative they want to push out, and to properly put in place the framework, the legislative and regulatory frameworks that promote one narrative without contradicting themselves, but also taking into what's the word? Also taking those contradictions that I had pointed out earlier, those realities that I had pointed out earlier about taxation and the global conversations that are being held around digital taxation into account. So I will stop there. I hope I've answered your question.
Yeah, so in light with the current COVID-19 pandemic or reality, what has been the impact of the pandemic on digital rights and democracy?
Wow, that's a really broad question, but I'll just try and answer it. I think some of the challenges that we have seen with COVID, includes one, especially for countries that are having their elections, restrictions on people being able to meet in public, to organize large gatherings, which has, as I mentioned earlier, pushed a lot of individuals onto social media platforms and the internet as an avenue to be able to communicate election information, and for political parties and candidates to be able to disseminate the information to the voting populace. However, some of the challenges that we have seen with these restrictions is that they have essentially offered the ruling party with a very strong, powerful tool to be able to restrict opposition parties from being able to disseminate the information, not just offline but also online. And so that's I think one of the really interesting impacts of the pandemic on electoral integrity and electoral processes in the continent. I think the second challenge that we have noted revolves around the issue of digital surveillance. We have noted, while contact tracing applications, which have geolocation capabilities, GPS capabilities, while these applications provide certain utilities in the pandemic responses by governments, as well as by private actors, there are associated risks that come with these technologies, including empowering governments with this very extensive surveillance, what should I call it? Not mechanism, but to be able to continue monitoring the communications of citizens online, to be able to now, comprehensively track individuals' movements. We've seen countries like Rwanda deploying robots which have facial recognition technologies. These technologies continue to be challenged at the global level. They continue to be challenged at the regional level because of their impact on rights, and not just privacy, but also the ability of individuals to be able to freely express themselves in both public and private spaces. And so it's very disconcerting to note that, governments are rolling out these surveillance technologies without there being proper data protection and privacy safeguards in place. I mean, Rwanda has ratified the Malabo Convention, but it hasn't really operationalized a data protection commissioner. So those are some of the challenges that we've noted. We've also seen challenges on the access front. While governments have taken very significant steps to increase access to their local populace, as I mentioned earlier, there's this contradiction of imposing restrictions that restrict these universal access rights. I think one of the positive impacts of COVID has been, it has essentially helped digital rights organizations and civil society organizations to continue hammering this maxim that digital rights are human rights. So many people have transitioned to using online communication platforms for work purposes, to order food, to get in touch with a doctor or medical professionals, amongst others. And so it's also helped us reiterate our core messaging, which has been very fantastic. All these negative implications notwithstanding. I think one of the other fantastic impacts of COVID has been the deployment of new technologies, new innovative technologies by private sector entities. I mean, we've seen Alphabet deploying, or rather was it Loon? Sorry, Loon, deploying the stratospheric balloons to expand universal access in remote rural areas of Kenya. And so that was a fantastic initiative, using very new innovative technologies. But again, going back to that core point of all these new fantastic tech must be balanced and viewed against, viewed from a human rights lens to ensure that people's rights are not violated and that people's rights are respected and promoted.
Thank you, Sigi. You mentioned about surveillance. That was my question. So between October 2020 to 2024, 7 Eastern African countries were and are scheduled to hold elections. Does the adoption of this pandemic surveillance, technologies such as, facial recognition technology, the GPS location data, have a spillover into the election phase?
So I actually wrote a piece on this. I'm very glad to hear you quoting it. What we had expressed in that particular blog post were fears that these technologies would be used in the electoral arena.
Yes.
As we've noted, some of these technologies, governments are not imposing sunset clauses on the uses of these technologies, which means that there is a risk that these technologies might be used for other purposes, including electoral purposes, especially by the reigning parties. So that is one of the fears. The second fear is that these technologies are not subservient to oversight by bodies. I mean, we don't have sufficient information about these technologies. We don't know who is deploying them. We don't know whether these are partnerships between the government and private actors. We don't know what kind of personal data is being collected by these technologies, how it is being used, whether the personal data that is being collected by this tech is being used for additional purposes. And we've seen governments increasingly harmonizing and linking databases and registers to each other. So there's a lot of lack of information about the use of these technologies. And so this then informed that particular blog post and the fears that were set out in that particular blog post about governments using and spilling over these technologies into the electoral arena. So I think it's very disconcerting that this issue of safeguards, and we keep hammering this issue of safeguards. Where are the safeguards? What are the safeguards? Governments are not being explicit about what those safeguards are, which naturally gives rise to these attendant fears. I think one of the worrying, just based off of some of the monitoring that we have been conducting in countries like Rwanda. Rwanda was recently accused of deploying several technologies in partnership with international private entities that had the ability to monitor and surveil and hack essentially into the phones of journalists, of political opposition leaders, amongst others. And so these are we are simply just capturing and expressing and calling for heightened safeguards as these new technologies are being deployed. I mean, it's fantastic that the technologies are being deployed in the first place because it shows that governments are increasingly adopting tech for various purposes, including tackling the surveillance. But these safeguards must be put in place before the technologies are deployed, when the technologies are being deployed, and after the technologies are being deployed. And this must also be met with attendant information flows to the general public about the safeguards that have been put in place as the tech is being deployed. So yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Yes.
And thank you, thank you very much for reading the article, sorry, the blog post.
Yes. So
Yeah.
let's discuss the content takedown and suspension of social media accounts, especially on Twitter. And this has been happening especially through the application of content rules and internet companies such as Facebook just determining what can be posted, what can't be posted, and what can be shared across these platforms. So, what do you think can be done to improve the protection of freedom of expression online?
I think this essentially just feeds into one of the campaigns that Article 19 has been deploying, called the Missing Voices campaign. This campaign is essentially Article 19 demanding social media platforms to avail individuals with more transparency around their content takedown processes, which, as we know, is very lacking, despite all of the information that they have put to the general public, as well as also providing more clarity about their account shutdowns and their account suspension processes, which you're aware they're very blurry, they're very not clear. You click on this link, it sends you to another one. It's very difficult to have your account unblocked when and if that has happened. I think one of the points that we have repeatedly hammered is that these social media platforms, when they are engaging individual users, that freedom to contract, necessarily comes into place, right? And this is a message that social media platforms repeatedly hammer, that if you want to use their platform, if you don't agree with their terms, don't use the platform. If you agree with their terms, use their platforms. But we've seen the kind of power and influence that these platforms are wielding in society, including in the electoral arena, following the Cambridge Analytica scandal in Kenya, as well as other countries. However, going back to the issue of expression rights, social media platforms, as part of the wide spectrum of private actors, are bound by, well, not bound by, but should try and respect the United Nations guiding principles on human rights, on business and human rights, which essentially puts an obligation and a responsibility on social media platforms to respect and promote human rights, including freedom of expression. And so I guess the first call to them would be, just building off of our campaign calls, would be more transparency is needed in so many things. I mean, these conversations around social media platforms continues to be very very dramatic. I think the second, so I think just respecting, promoting, and fulfilling human rights. That obligation. I mean, companies should commit more to promoting these particular obligations, and to ensuring that they are fulfilling the human rights obligations according to these principles. But also, going back to our calls for transparency. More transparency is needed around very many of their processes and so on.
Finally, maybe any last comments or maybe discussion around internet freedom and democracy or digital rights, not only in Africa but also Africa as a whole.
I think I'll only be able to speak about Eastern Africa because that's the context around which we operate in.
Okay.
I think just to point out that, just to reiterate the point that I had made earlier, about governments giving and taking, about collaboration. We have increasingly entered, as you mentioned, into a very globalized world. And the internet and digital communication platforms have become one of the, because obviously, our internet access is not available for everyone, But for those who do have access, it has become a primary vehicle for individuals to be able to work, to access goods and services, including medical and health services. I think my takeaway would be just to reiterate this maxim that we usually put out, that digital rights are human rights, and governments have taken, governments are bound by international obligations, by regional obligations, as well as also by constitutional obligations to respect and to promote these rights. And so restrictions on individuals' rights, consequently, the implications are broad, they're vast. And we've already discussed a lot of the issues that you had mentioned. I think one of the pointers that I really want to hammer is the use of computer misuse and cybercrimes provisions by government, um, as well as hate speech provisions. These must, they must. I mean, you cannot put in broad, vague provisions and expect, restricting the transmission of information, and expect people to be okay with that. I mean, if a particular legislative provision or framework is not compatible with human rights, then we will challenge them. We will push back. I think that's just the takeaway that I had wanted to put out.
Thank you so much, Sigi.
Yeah. Thank you, Suzanne.